Prisoners of war move along Tallinn streets flanked by troops of the Estonian Rifle Corps. These are Germans, descendants of the people who tried to suppress the Estonian people for 7 centuries. Now they are reminded of the lesson they were given in 1944. The flag of freedom flies above the fortifications of Toompea. On November 24th, 1944, the last remaining corner of Estonia, the Sõrve Peninsula, was occupied by the Soviets. Soviet people, mainly soldiers from neighboring Russia, were brought in to implement and consolidate Soviet power, to build a new sort of societal order. For those who hadn't left Estonia, the most frightening thing now was uncertainty. What would happen next? Would there be another deportation? Would more people be killed? For many, the only consolation they could find was to wait for the legendary White Ship, a phrase meaning rescue by the democratic Western powers. The war was over. Still insidious, the Red regime seemed to have become milder. Parts of the Estonian national anthem remained in use. Christmas Day remained a holiday under a different name. But a week before Christmas, mass terror returned, with Decree number 380, applying to those who had collaborated with the Germans. During the next 5 years, 12,000 people were arrested. I was at a meeting in Tallinn. It was disgusting and painful to see how a young man was arrested behind my back. He was taken away because he did not take off his hat when they played the Internationale. Some of the Russians were on our side. In the beginning, we went to a Russian family near Palmse. They gave us shelter. They didn't like communism. The Russian nationality wasn't bad, but the government was.
Need ei olnud ka selle poolt, kommunismi poolt, ega Vene rahvus ei olnud halbi, aga see valitsus oli niimoodi.
The tension of the times is not apparent in these peaceful scenes. People didn't want to go along with the new order, but one has to live and work. The new rulers began seeking their enemies. Power was in the hands of the party. 500 occupation troops were dispatched to every county. Informers, snitches, and agents were recruited using extreme pressure.
I
wouldn't say that their attitude was directly hostile, apart from those officers with golden epaulets who belonged to the security police and beat me all day so that my bottom was in shreds. But these, of course, weren't what you would call real officers. This wasn't what one would normally call an army. They were murderers and butchers. These are two totally different things. They kept harassing my mother. A gentleman, so to speak, visited her during the daytime when father was working and I was at school. He asked mother, what do they speak about, this person or that person? Propaganda blamed the Germans for the destruction of cities that had actually been carried out by the Soviet armed forces. The ruins were leveled and old valuable buildings were destroyed. The city of Narva ceased to exist. Pärnu, Tallinn, and Tartu were partially destroyed. Many monuments were destroyed in order to make people forget their history. Rebuilding the hometown that endured suffering during the war has become a labor of honor for all citizens. Our builders can proudly report that the reconstruction of the Estonia Opera House was successfully finished in time for the 30th anniversary of the great October Socialist Revolution. The greatest cultural building of Soviet Estonia has been finished and is more beautiful than ever. This architectural and artistic transformation is a great achievement made possible by the work of the Soviet people. It took 3 years to rebuild the Estonia Opera House. Reconstruction of this important building was part of a plan that emphasized conciliation, but only in the beginning. The Stalinist interior design, especially the painted ceiling, was a song of praise to the happiness brought by the rays of Stalin's sun. Immediately after the Russians arrived, they began to arrest those who had served in the German army. When friends, neighbors, and relatives were arrested, those who hadn't been caught yet had no alternative but to take to the forests. The ranks of the guerrilla movement included a lot of men who had fought in the German or Finnish armed forces. The father and mother were killed and one son escaped. He had been shot in the leg, but he managed to get home and hide, but they knew that he was there. I was teaching a German lesson and saw how they brought them. The fathers of the boys, they were from Võhma and Palmse. They were flanked by soldiers. Russians had come into Pruna village and were stealing. A neighbor went to stop them, but they killed him with an axe handle. Industrialization began. Enterprises in Estonia, both new and reconstructed, rarely made sense in terms of being economically viable. The labor force was brought into Estonia. One of the goals was to Russify the population. The number of industrial workers tripled in 6 years. The eastern part of Virumaa was almost completely Russified. In the towns as well, especially in Tallinn, an influx of foreign workers began. Industrial production was down by more than half in comparison to 1941. Reconstruction of industry meant that Estonia was integrated into the Soviet all-union system with an emphasis on heavy industry. A new oil shale gas industry was created to supply Leningrad. Expansion of the oil shale industry brought with it extremely rapid industrial growth, 36% a year. Overexploited Estonian farms had to feed cities and industries. Rationing was the order of the day. Long lines were everywhere. People took their places at night. The notorious sugar lines were half a kilometer long. People went there in the middle of the night, and the next day they got their half a kilo of sugar. 1 month's worth. Those who didn't have food cards took shelter in the woods. According to various estimates, there were 15,000 to 30,000 men in the forests after the war, from all walks of life. Some fought, weapon in hand, while others simply hid. There were more freedom fighters in Võrumaa and Pärnumaa than anywhere else. The most active period of the guerrilla war lasted up until the mass deportations of 1949. Estonian partisans didn't accomplish that much militarily, but morally their struggle was of great importance. We took a car. The sexton's son, Edward, dressed as a militiaman, and I played the role of a traffic controller. A car came from Pärnu. We stopped it with a red flag. I told the driver, "Get out of the car." We went to the Russian and said, "Hands up, we are Estonian guerrillas." A car came from Narva. When it stopped, we were given a sign. We opened fire at once. There was a driver, a staff officer, and a third man. They were all killed. We pushed the car aside and set it on fire.
Lükkasime siis masina tie pealt ära ja panime siis põlema.
They attacked military convoys and officers of the secret police, often executive committees too, which on the local level were the main instruments of the Soviet occupation. We decided with Jakub, who had served in the Estonian Corps, that we ought to go to the communal building. We wrapped our feet in rags and potato bags so as to not make any noise. Our haul included automatic weapons, Estonian military rifles, and magazines for the semi-automatic weapons, which were very hard to get. We also took some food. Then